He was just a tired single father having tea alone after work, counting the minutes until he had to pick up his son from school, when an old woman suddenly grabbed his hand and whispered 6 words that would drag him into a life so dangerous, it would expose a buried family secret, a stolen fortune, and a truth that would shatter 3 generations. Before this story ends, one man will have to choose between walking away, or becoming the husband he never planned to be, for a woman he never expected to love. If you believe fate can hide in the smallest moments, subscribe now, because stories like this don't just entertain, they change the way you see people forever. The single dad had chosen the quiet cafe for one reason only, because no one there asked questions and no one cared that he sat alone with a cracked mug of black tea growing cold between his hands, his jacket still on, his phone buzzing occasionally with reminders he couldn't afford to ignore, reminders of school fees, rent deadlines, and the silent ache of raising a child alone after his wife's sudden death had hollowed his world into a routine of survival rather than living. He wasn't lonely in the romantic sense, not anymore, because loneliness had become familiar, like background noise, something you learned to live with when life took more than it gave back. The cafe smelled of old wood and burnt sugar, the kind of place where time slowed down, where pensioners read newspapers and young couples whispered plans, and that was when he noticed her, the old woman sitting 2 tables away, hands trembling slightly as she stirred her tea, eyes darting nervously toward the entrance every few seconds as though she were waiting for someone she feared more than hoped for. He thought nothing of it at first, because life had trained him not to get involved, not to invite unnecessary chaos, but when the door opened and a sharply dressed man stepped inside, scanning the room with cold precision, the air seemed to tighten, and before the single dad could look away, the old woman was suddenly beside him, her fingers gripping his wrist with surprising strength, her voice barely a breath as she whispered, "Please, pretend you're my daughter's fiancé." Time stalled. His instinct was to pull back, to refuse, to stand up and leave, because lies had already cost him too much in life, but something in her eyes, raw terror mixed with desperate hope, froze him in place. The well-dressed man's footsteps echoed closer, and without fully understanding why, the single dad nodded, rising from his chair, slipping his arm around the old woman's shoulders as if it were the most natural thing in the world, feeling the lie settle heavily on his chest. When the man reached them, his smile was polite but sharp, the kind of smile worn by people who enjoyed control, and his gaze flicked between the single dad and the old woman with clear suspicion. The old woman laughed nervously, introducing him as her future son-in-law, explaining they were celebrating quietly because family gatherings had become complicated, and the single dad played along, inventing a story about working long hours, about loving her daughter deeply, about plans to marry once life settled down, each word stacking higher, more dangerous than the last. The man listened, nodded, and finally smiled in a way that made the single dad's stomach twist, before leaving with a thinly veiled warning about family obligations and unfinished business. Only after he was gone did the old woman collapse into the chair, breath shaking, whispering thank you over and over, her hands now trembling uncontrollably, and it was then the single dad learned that nothing about this encounter was random. She confessed that her daughter had disappeared years ago after falling in love with the wrong man, that the family fortune tied to an old estate had become the target of ruthless relatives, and that the man who had just left was her late husband's nephew, a man who believed controlling bloodlines was the same as owning people. The single dad wanted to walk away, but fate had already tangled him in something far bigger than a stranger's lie, because when she showed him a faded photograph of her daughter, his breath caught, not from recognition, but from an unexplainable sense that his quiet, struggling life had just collided with a storm he could no longer avoid. The lie should have ended that day, but it didn't, because life has a cruel sense of humor, and the single dad received a call the very next morning from the old woman, asking him to come to her house just once more, just until things settled, just until the will could be finalized and the threats stopped, and against every logical instinct he had, he agreed, convincing himself it was temporary, that he could step away once she was safe. The house was a decaying mansion on the edge of town, beautiful in the way abandoned dreams often were, filled with portraits that watched silently and hallways that echoed with memories, and it was there he learned the full truth, that the daughter hadn't vanished willingly, that she'd fled an arranged marriage meant to secure the family wealth, and that the man stalking them now believed eliminating obstacles was easier than negotiating. As days turned into weeks, the single dad found himself attending dinners, legal meetings, and tense family gatherings, pretending to be engaged to a woman he had never met, carrying a ring borrowed from a locked drawer, while his own son asked innocent questions about why daddy was suddenly wearing nicer clothes and coming home later. The pressure intensified when the daughter unexpectedly returned, walking into the mansion like a ghost stepping back into her own grave, older, hardened, furious that her mother had dragged a stranger into their mess, and yet shaken when she realized how real the danger had become. She and the single dad clashed constantly, arguing over trust, over lies, over whether survival justified deception, but beneath the anger was something neither wanted to admit, a recognition of shared loss, of people who had both been broken by circumstances beyond their control. The nephew's threats escalated, legal loopholes tightened, and the single dad discovered documents proving the daughter was the rightful heir, documents that someone had been actively trying to destroy. When the nephew attempted to expose the engagement publicly, hoping to humiliate them and regain leverage, the single dad made a choice he never thought he would. He stood in front of the family, the lawyers, and the cameras, and claimed the lie as his truth, not for money, not for safety, but because he realized walking away now would condemn an innocent family to ruin. But lies demand payment, and the cost came swiftly. The nephew uncovered the single dad's past, his financial struggles, his vulnerabilities as a widower, and used them to threaten custody of his son, forcing him into an impossible corner where protecting one family meant risking the other. The daughter, witnessing this sacrifice, finally understood that the man pretending to love her had become the only person truly fighting for her, and when she confessed that she had started to fall for him despite everything, the weight of the lie became unbearable, because love born from deception carried a fear deeper than hatred, the fear that once the truth came out, everything would collapse. The final confrontation arrived not in violence but in revelation, when the old woman revealed her own secret, that she had known where her daughter was all along, that she had allowed the lie to grow because fear had made her weak, and that the single dad's presence had forced her to finally face the damage her silence had caused. Armed with evidence, witness statements, and the nephew's own recorded threats, they dismantled his control piece by piece, exposing him publicly and legally until the empire he thought he owned crumbled under the weight of truth. The engagement was revealed as a ruse, the press lost interest, the mansion grew quiet again, and the single dad stood at the edge of his old life, ready to return to anonymity, believing his role was finished. But endings are rarely clean, and love doesn't vanish simply because a lie is exposed. The daughter followed him, admitting that pretending had shown her what real partnership looked like, admitting that she didn't want a savior or a fortune, but a man who chose integrity over comfort, and for the first time since his wife's death, the single dad allowed himself to imagine a future not defined by loss. He introduced her to his son not as a fiancé, not as a lie, but as someone important, someone honest, and in that quiet moment, free from threats and expectations, something real finally began. The old woman watched from a distance, understanding that the greatest inheritance she could leave wasn't money or property, but the courage to choose truth over fear. And the single dad, who had only wanted a quiet cup of tea, learned that sometimes life whispers instead of shouts, and the smallest decisions, like agreeing to pretend, can lead you exactly where you were meant to be.